so. Canada filed a formal legal complaint against the United States at 2 a.m, and Washington found out from a journalist, not from the Canadian government, not from a back channel, not from the diplomatic courtesy notification that every country in the history of the World Trade Organization has extended to the other party before initiating a formal dispute, the professional gesture, the advance call, the procedural heads up that says, "We are about to do this, we wanted you to know first." Canada did not make that call. Canada's trade lawyers worked through the night, filed a comprehensive WTO dispute settlement request at 2:07 a.m. Ottawa time, and went home. When a Reuters correspondent called the United States Trade Representative's Communications Office at 6:17 a.m. asking for a response to Canada's W-2 filing, the person who answered the phone did not know what the reporter was talking about. The filing is 41 pages. It covers every category of American tariff that has touched the $760 billion trading relationship. It cites specific W-2 provisions, GATT, Article 2, Article 6, the Agreement on Safeguards that Canada's legal team has spent 4 months documenting. It requests the formation of a formal dispute settlement panel, and it begins the clock on a legal process that under W-2 rules will take a minimum of 4 years to complete and could extend to 7, a process that will exist independently of any bilateral negotiation, that will generate a formal international legal record of this dispute, and that cannot be stopped by a press release or a trade deal or a statement from either government saying the matter has been resolved. Canada filed at 2 a.m. without telling Washington. And by the time the United States government knew it had happened, the document was already public. The W-2 Secretariat in Geneva had already acknowledged receipt, and 11 journalists were already holding for a response. Warren Buffett reached for comment by 2 financial journalists within the hour, said 4 words before his full statement arrived that afternoon. He said, "They decided to build." When you understand what 41 pages filed at 2 a.m. actually means for the $760 billion trading relationship, for the 60-day window that was supposed to be producing resolution, and for the next 4 to 7 years of the most economically consequential bilateral relationship on earth, you'll understand why senior trade lawyers on both sides are saying tonight that this is the moment the dispute changed category. Hit subscribe because the 2M filing started a legal clock that doesn't stop, and what it produces will reshape this relationship long after this administration is gone. Let me walk you through how we got here. Because Canada does not file a 41-page W-2 complaint at 2 a.m. without building it across months of very deliberate preparation, and understanding that preparation is the only way to understand what the 207 timestamp actually means. From the first day of the tariff announcement, Canada's trade legal team had been building a W-2 case in parallel with the bilateral diplomatic track. This is standard practice for sophisticated trade law operations and Canada's trade law capacity, which operates out of the Department of Foreign Affairs, Trade and Development, supported by a network of specialized external counsel who have spent careers in Geneva, is among the most capable in the world. The bilateral track is where governments talk. The W-2 track is where governments build the legal architecture that determines what happens if the talking fails. Canada built both simultaneously from day one. The 41 pages filed at 2 a.m. were not written in the weeks before the filing. They were assembled and refined over 4 months of meticulous legal documentation, each tariff measure cataloged against the specific W-2 provisions it potentially violated, each Canadian counter-tariff defensively framed within the provisions that would need to sustain it in panel proceedings. Each economic impact figure sourced and attributed in ways that would meet the evidentiary standards of a W-2 dispute settlement panel. What was filed at 2:07 was not a reactive document. It was a product of a legal operation that had been running since the day the tariff was announced, producing documentation that would be ready to file the moment the decision was made to file it. The decision was made in a specific meeting in Ottawa on a Monday afternoon, 4 days before the TUM filing. According to sources familiar with the Canadian government's internal deliberations, the meeting involved the trade minister, senior officials from the trade law team, and representatives from the Prime Minister's office. The specific question on the table was not whether to file. The documentation was complete. The question was when and whether to give Washington advance notice. Most people don't know what the diplomatic norm actually is in WTO dispute filings between allied nations. The formal WTO rules do not require advance notification. The filing is a sovereign right, exercisable without prior notice. But the diplomatic practice between countries with long-standing trade relationships, and particularly between countries with the depth of institutional relationship that Canada and the United States have maintained for 60 years, has always been to provide informal advance notice. A call from a trade minister or a trade representative, a message through diplomatic channels, an acknowledgement that this is coming, and that the other side should prepare to respond. The practice is not a legal obligation. It is the expression of a relationship that operates with a baseline of professional courtesy. Canada did not extend that courtesy, and the specific decision not to do so, made in that Monday afternoon meeting, according to sources familiar with its outcome, was itself a communication. It was not carelessness. It was not an oversight. It was the deliberate, considered, formally approved decision of a government that had concluded the professional courtesy norm should not apply to a relationship that the other side had been conducting for 141 days in a manner that the Canadian government no longer recognized as consistent with that norm. The 60-day structured reassessment window had not produced the specific phased tariff adjustments that Buffett had identified as necessary. The bilateral working groups had met. They had generated documentation. They had produced language. What they had not produced by the Monday afternoon meeting in Ottawa was the binding, benchmark-linked, operationally specific framework that the Canadian government's legal and economic teams had identified as the minimum standard for a genuine resolution. The window was being used to talk. The talking was not producing the commitments, and Canada's W-2 documentation was complete, sitting in a file, ready to file. The filing time, 2:07 in the morning, was not chosen for drama. It was chosen for precision. Geneva, where the W-2 Secretariat operates, is 6 hours ahead of Ottawa. 2:07 in the morning Ottawa time is 8:07 in Geneva, precisely 7 minutes after the W-2 Secretariat's official document receipt system opens for the business day. Canada filed at the earliest possible moment the Geneva system would accept the document. The timestamp is not a statement. It is a schedule. The absence of diplomatic notice is the statement. The office where Canada's trade legal team worked through the night is on the 14th floor of a government building in Ottawa that does not have the kind of architectural presence that announces its occupants' work to the world. It is a functional building, the kind of space that houses the administrative infrastructure of a country's foreign policy apparatus without calling attention to itself. On the night of the filing, according to sources familiar with the operation, 7 people were present from 10 in the evening until the document was transmitted. A lead trade counsel, 2 deputy counsels, 2 policy analysts, a communications director whose role was not to draft a press release. No press release had been prepared, but to manage the information environment in the hours after filing, once the W-2 Secretariat's acknowledgement of receipt went into its system and became technically retrievable by anyone with W-2 document access. The document they were finalizing was 41 pages of dense, technically precise legal argument. This is not the kind of document that reads like a political statement or a diplomatic complaint. W-2 filings are legal instruments, structured around specific treaty provisions, citing specific measures, making specific legal claims that will be evaluated by a panel of trade law experts applying specific legal standards. The 41 pages contained 11 specific tariff measures being challenged, 5 specific W-2 agreements cited, 23 specific provisions identified. An economic impact documentation running to 73 footnoted data points, each one sourced and each one capable of surviving the scrutiny of adversarial cross-examination in a formal panel proceeding. At 1:48 in the morning, the lead counsel transmitted a final review copy to the Trade Minister's office. At 1:56, authorization to file was confirmed. At 2:03, the document was submitted to the WTO's electronic filing system. At 2:07, the system generated a receipt timestamp. The filing was complete. In Geneva, it was 8:07 in the morning. The W2 Secretariat's day had begun 4 minutes earlier. The document entered the queue. In Ottawa, the 7 people who had worked through the night gathered their materials, confirmed that the system had generated the receipt, and began the process of leaving the building. In Washington, it was 2:07 in the morning. The city was asleep. The Office of the United States Trade Representative, which has a 24-hour duty officer for significant developments, had received no communication from the Canadian government. The American Embassy in Ottawa, which maintains its own monitoring of Canadian government activity, had received no notification. The National Security Council's overnight duty staff, which monitors significant diplomatic developments by allied governments, had received nothing. The W2 filing was in the Geneva system. The American government did not know it existed. At 6:03 in the morning Washington time, a Reuters correspondent who monitors the W2 Secretariat's document system, a standard practice for trade journalists covering the organization, retrieved the Canadian filing from the public docket where W2 dispute settlement requests are posted upon acceptance. He read the first 3 pages. He called his editor. At 6:17, he called the Ulster Communications Office. The person who answered the phone at the Ulster at 6:17 did not know what a 41-page W2 filing against the United States by Canada was, because at 6:17, no one in the United States government had been notified that it existed. The Reuters correspondent waited on the line for 4 minutes and 12 seconds while the communications officer attempted to reach someone with relevant knowledge. At 6:21, he was told the Ulster would provide a response in due course, and the call was ended. Due course, in this case, meant 3 hours and 47 minutes. The official Ulster response was released at 10:08, by which time every major financial publication, every trade law publication, every diplomatic monitoring service in North America, Europe, and the Indo-Pacific had already read the 41 pages, published their initial analyses, and begun placing calls to trade law experts for interpretation. Washington had been last to know. By the time it spoke, the entire professional world that cares about international trade law had already had a 4-hour head start on understanding what Canada had done. The immediate market reaction was concentrated and directional. Within 30 minutes of the Reuters report going live at 6:44 in the morning, the formal article, with full documentation of the filing, the Canadian dollar gained against the US dollar by a margin that currency analysts characterized as significant, not the incremental repricing of probability that Buffett's 4-sentence statement had produced, but a sharper, more definitive movement consistent with the market interpreting the W2 filing not as a negotiating signal but as a structural development. Canada was not threatening legal action. Canada had taken it. The T-Sex composite opened up. In the United States, the sectors most exposed to the bilateral trade disruption saw mixed movement, a nuanced market response that reflected the dual nature of what the W2 filing produced. On one hand, any development that signals a formal international mechanism is now engaged with the dispute creates a potential path toward the legal resolution that markets always prefer to indefinite uncertainty. On the other hand, a W2 dispute settlement process takes 4 to 7 years to complete, and the existence of a formal legal process running in parallel with any bilateral negotiation creates complications that bilateral negotiations conducted in the absence of parallel legal proceedings do not face. The Canadian government's public statement was released at 9:15 Ottawa time. 23 words. Canada has initiated WTO dispute settlement proceedings regarding American tariff measures affecting Canadian exports. Canada remains committed to constructive engagement on bilateral trade issues. 23 words, every syllable of which was deliberately chosen and reviewed by 3 layers of communications and legal staff before release. According to sources on the Canadian side, the 23-word statement was itself the product of a specific strategic decision to characterize the WTO filing as a legal action that existed in parallel with, rather than in replacement of, the bilateral track. Canada was not declaring the bilateral track dead. It was building a legal structure that would exist independently of the bilateral track's outcome. The distinction mattered. A declaration that bilateral negotiations were over would have produced a different market reaction and a different diplomatic response. The parallel framing kept the 60-day window technically operative while making clear to anyone reading the filing itself that Canada was no longer relying on bilateral good faith as its only instrument. Inside the White House, the reaction was what sources describe as a specific kind of institutional shock. Not anger, not denial, but the particular disorientation that institutions experience when a development occurs for which the available response frameworks are genuinely inadequate. The communications team had spent 141 days building response frameworks for every conceivable bilateral development. A Canadian WTO filing was not a bilateral development. It was an international legal development. It required a legal response developed in coordination with Trade Law Counsel that was consistent with the American government's legal position before the WTO, a position that the American government now needed to articulate formally on the record in ways that would be reviewed by a panel of international trade law experts. That is a very different problem from responding to a press release. 4 hours and 47 minutes different, it turned out. Warren Buffett's statement arrived that afternoon, and it explained with the precision that 63 years of watching the intersection of economic policy and institutional credibility produces exactly what the 207 timestamp and the 4-hour gap in Washington's awareness meant. Warren Buffett released his statement at 2:14 in the afternoon, the same time to the minute that he had released his 4-sentence statement that produced 24 hours of White House silence. The symmetry, sources familiar with his communications process confirm, was deliberate. He does not make accidental choices about timing. The statement was 5 paragraphs. It was the most specific thing he had written about the Canada dispute, more operationally precise than the midnight call, more legally focused than the 4-sentence statement that had produced the institutional silence, more forward-looking than the follow-up letter. He had been reading the 41 pages since 7 in the morning. Canada, Buffett began, just told the world something in the specific institutional language that the world takes most seriously. It told the world that it has concluded the bilateral track, operating alone, is insufficient to produce the outcome the $760 billion trading relationship requires. It did not say this in a press release or a diplomatic communique. It said it in 41 pages of WTO dispute settlement documentation that will now exist in the international trade law record, regardless of what any bilateral negotiation produces. That is a specific kind of statement. It is the kind that cannot be walked back by a phone call. He addressed the TUM filing time directly because the detail had dominated the coverage, and he understood why. The time of the filing is not the story, he wrote. The absence of advance notification is the story. In 63 years of watching bilateral relationships between allied nations, I have never seen a WTO dispute filing between close partners made without advance notification to the other party. The notification is not legally required. It is the expression of a relationship in which both parties recognize that they are partners, not adversaries, even when they disagree about specific measures. Canada's decision not to make that notification is a precise, deliberate, legally sophisticated communication. It says the relationship has changed category, not permanently perhaps, but for the purposes of this action, at this moment. You are not a partner we are required to extend courtesy to. You are a respondent. He continued into the legal dimension that most commentary had been treating superficially. A W-2 dispute settlement process is not a negotiating threat. It is a legal proceeding with its own timeline, its own evidentiary standards, and its own outcome structure that exists independently of whatever the bilateral parties negotiate between themselves. When Canada files 41 pages in Geneva, those 41 pages create a formal, international legal record of every American tariff measure challenged, every W-2 provision cited, and every economic impact documented. That record does not disappear if the bilateral parties reach a deal. It becomes part of the institutional memory of how the world's most economically productive bilateral trading relationship was managed during a specific period. In 63 years, I have never seen an institution comfortable with the record it was going to leave at the W to file that record. Canada is comfortable with theirs. And then the passage that every trade law analyst and every investment strategist has been citing since the afternoon it appeared. In 63 years of watching markets and governance, I have observed that the most reliable signal of a party's actual confidence in its position is not what it says in public statements. It is what it builds when no one is watching. Canada has been building for 4 months. The 41 pages filed at 2:07 in the morning are not the beginning of what Canada built. They are the documentation of it. And the 4-hour gap between the filing and Washington's awareness of the filing is not a communications failure. It is a measurement. It is the precise, documented measurement of how far the information asymmetry between these two governments has traveled in 141 days. Buffett's verdict: you know which party has studied the situation more carefully when one of them files 41 pages at 2 in the morning and the other one reads about it in the newspaper. What a formal W to dispute settlement filing produces, in legal terms, in economic terms, in diplomatic terms, and in the terms of the long-term structural relationship between the two countries, cascades in specific directions that the official communications from both sides are systematically designed to obscure. Begin with the legal layer, because it is the one that is least understood and most consequential. The W-2 dispute settlement process that Canada has now initiated operates on its own track, under its own rules, according to its own timeline, regardless of what the bilateral parties agree to or fail to agree to. A dispute settlement panel will be established. It will consist of 3 trade law experts selected through a process governed by W-2 rules. It will review the 41 pages Canada filed and the American government's response. It will hear evidence. It will issue a ruling. The timeline for this process, under the dispute settlement understanding, is a minimum of 15 months for a panel ruling, with the possibility of appeal to the appellate body adding additional years. The full process, including appeals, regularly runs 4 to 7 years. During those 4 to 7 years, the bilateral trade relationship will continue. Deals may be reached. Tariffs may be adjusted. The 60-day structured reassessment may produce outcomes. But the W-2 process will continue regardless of those outcomes, producing a formal legal record of whether the American tariffs were consistent with U.S. obligations under international trade law. That record constrains future American options in specific ways. It creates legal precedent. It establishes evidentiary standards that future disputes will be measured against. It is, in the most precise sense, the institutionalization of this dispute in international law, a process that survives any bilateral agreement, any administration change, and any diplomatic normalization. The economic layer is more immediately legible. Markets interpret a W-2 filing as a specific kind of signal. The party filing has made a formal legal assessment that the measures being challenged are inconsistent with the respondent's international obligations. That assessment does not move markets, because markets believe the W-2 will necessarily rule in Canada's favor. It moves markets because it signals that Canada has decided the legal track is a necessary instrument alongside the bilateral track, which means Canada has made a specific judgment about the reliability of the bilateral track as a standalone resolution mechanism. The 4-hour gap in Washington's awareness amplified that signal. A government that does not know its closest trading partner has filed a WTO complaint against it until a journalist calls as a government that the market is assessing in real time as operating with an information disadvantage. The diplomatic dimension is the one that carries the longest institutional tail. Canada has now done something in its relationship with the United States that cannot be undone by any subsequent bilateral agreement. It has filed a formal dispute. It has created a W2 docket number. It has put its legal position on the international record in the institution that governs international trade law. Other W2 members, the European Union, Japan, South Korea, Australia, the other members of the international trading system that has operated under this institutional framework since 1995, have now observed the United States' most economically integrated ally formally initiating dispute settlement against the United States in the institution that is supposed to be the architecture of the American-led rules-based trading order. That observation is not academic. It is being incorporated into the trade policy calculations of every country that has been watching the American approach to its allies since this administration began. If Canada, which shares a continent, a language, a defense perimeter, and 6 decades of unprecedented economic integration with the United States, has concluded that the WTO is a necessary instrument against American tariff policy, every other country's trade policy team is running the specific calculation of what that conclusion means for their own relationship with Washington. China is watching. Russia is watching. The Indo-Pacific economies that the United States has been asking to join American-led economic frameworks as alternatives to Chinese influence are watching. And what they are watching is an American ally filing 41 pages in Geneva at 2 a.m. without calling Washington first. The W2 clock is running. It does not have a pause button. What Canada filed at 2:07 in the morning, 41 pages, 11 measures challenged, 5 W2 agreements cited, 73 footnoted economic data points, is not a dramatic document. It is not written to be read by a television audience or interpreted for a general public that follows trade disputes through headlines. It is written for 3 trade law experts who will be appointed to a panel and who will apply the specific legal standards of the W2 dispute settlement understanding to the specific measures challenged in the specific treaty provisions cited. It will be read by those 3 experts. It will also be read with equal care by every trade law operation and every major economy on earth that monitors W2 dispute filings, and by every investment institution that uses international trade law developments as an input into the economic models that determine where capital flows. The 2:07 timestamp and the 4-hour Washington knowledge gap are the images of this moment. They are the images because they are specific and because they are legible without a law degree. But the substance of the moment is the 41 pages themselves. The 41 pages that Canada spent 4 months building while the bilateral track was proceeding and while the 60-day window was opening, and while 8 Republican senators were breaking with their president, and while Buffett was calling Carney at midnight, and while 4 paragraphs were producing 24 hours of White House silence. Canada was doing all of those things simultaneously, and it was building 41 pages in parallel. Warren Buffett wrote that the most reliable signal of a party's actual confidence in its position is not what it says in public statements. It is what it builds when no one is watching. Canada built for 4 months in a legal office in Ottawa while publicly conducting bilateral diplomacy and bilaterally responding to every signal from the American side with the measured, professional language of a government that was committed to resolution. The $760 billion relationship, $14.2 billion every single day. 41 pages filed at 2:07 in the morning. A 4-hour gap between filing and Washington's awareness. These numbers define a specific moment. The moment the dispute graduated from a bilateral political negotiation into an international legal proceeding with a timeline of its own. The bilateral track continues. The 60-day window still technically has days remaining. The working groups will still meet. But they will now meet in the shadow of 41 pages in Geneva that carry their own clock, their own evidentiary standards, and their own definition of what resolution actually requires. Buffett wrote that you know which party has studied the situation more carefully when one of them files 41 pages at 2 in the morning and the other reads about it in the newspaper. The newspaper. At 6:17 in the morning, when a Reuters journalist called the Uster to ask about a document that the most powerful trade office in the world had not yet been told existed. That is where the $760 billion relationship stands tonight. And the clock in Geneva, which does not observe Washington's communication schedule, does not observe diplomatic courtesy norms, and does not wait for anyone's press release, started at 2:07. It is still running.